With Himeko Nova's beta wrapping up, it's time for us to take one last look at her kit and how she ended up. Did she make it out of the beta alive? What is her general power level relative to other DPSs? What are her best teams? What is the final verdict on Himeko Nova? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. I have a video covering how Himeko Nova's kit works, and while this was made during the V1 of her beta cycle, and thus many of the numbers from that video have all changed, the general function of her kit has remained the same. So you can check out that video for a more in-depth explanation of her kit. To keep things short, Himeko Nova's playstyle revolves around her assist skills, an extra button that she gives to every character on the team. Very similar to the extra button we can use during weekly boss fights, such as summoning the train against Sunday or summoning Hyacinth against Aquila. Any ally can trigger the assist skill on their turn, albeit you only get one use of the assist skill before Himeko needs to take a turn to refresh it. And the assist skill will consume the active character's turn unless the character is an Astral Express teammate, wherein they instead get an extra turn after using the assist skill. Himeko's assist skill summons her giant robot to do big damage, and this is where the majority of her damage comes from, aside from her ultimate, which is another big nuke of damage from the robot. Himeko Nova really benefits from pairing up with Astral Express teammates, and the benefits she gets changes depending on which of them she teams up with. Welt, the Marches, and original Himeko will trigger Himeko's Decimation mode, which mainly focuses on buffing her assist skill damage and buffing the team's crit damage, while the rest of the Astral Express crew, like Sunday, the Trailblazers, and the Danhungs, will trigger Himeko's Verdict mode, which mainly focuses on buffing her ultimate damage. All of Himeko's team building will revolve around selecting which four modes you want to play her in and which teammates you want to trigger her assist skills, since only one teammate can trigger an assist skill before Himeko needs to take a turn to refresh this usage. Decimation is inherently dependent on having multiple enemies on the field, since it depends on the total enemy hit count in order to trigger her extra assist skills from her Decimation mode. Because of this, anytime you're in a strictly single target scenario, for example against regular Sam, you're almost always going to default to playing Verdict instead. But what do her Decimation and Verdict teams look like? For starters, let's go over the different possible options in a Himeko Nova team and what they're all offering. Himeko Nova herself is obviously going to be the main DPS of her own team. While she does bring a bit of team buffing, you would hardly ever use her as anything other than a hyper carry. Then there's the sustain option that is also not changing outside of niche sustainless scenarios. Himiko's two main sustain options will be Danhung PT or Huohuo, both of whom have been obtainable for free at different points, and both of whom have their own specific teammate synergies that can make them more valuable than the other. So let's go over those other teammates before we come back to the sustain discussion. First off, Himeko Nova will almost always want one other Astral Express teammate, even if Danhung PT is on the team. Due to the limited options, the only ones that really stand out as being powerful enough hypercarry supports are Sunday, RMC, and Welt. Sunday brings consistent action advancing at the expense of underwhelming damage amplification. RMC brings solid buffing through true damage and mem attacks to help charge Decimation if need be, at the expense of less reliable action advances. And Welt just brings really strong general buffs at the expense of no action advance whatsoever. Each of them are strong in their own right, and the way you pick between these three is sort of dependent on who your last support slot is and the enemies you're fighting. So who are our options for this last support slot, and how do they help us round out the rest of the team? First off, all of the characters in the Astral Express teammate slot can actually also go in this last support slot, meaning you can just mix and match between the trio of Welt, Sunday, and RMC in order to make a team. This isn't going to be the best team, but it technically is an option. Outside of Sunday and RMC, I would never run these two together because Sunday burns through RMC's true damage buff turns so fast, and the action advances can be a bit unreliable. However, generally your best options for this last teammate slot is going to be between Sparkle and Mortonak's Blade. Despite not being Astral Express members, Sparkle and Mortonak's Blade are just generally strong enough characters to brute force their way onto the Himeko team due to having such high buffing potential. Not to mention Sparkle's action advance and Mortonak's Blade's high hit count to stack Decimation just leads to these two characters having a lot of extra utility for Himeko as well. Thus, generally I would recommend your Himeko Nova team to look like this. Himeko Nova, one of the Astral Express supports of your choosing. We'll talk about who excels where in a second. One of the non-Astral Express supports between Sparkle and Blade. And then lastly, your sustain choice between Danhung PT and Huohuo. Huohuo is only noticeably better than Danhung, specifically if you're using Mortonak's Blade, since Blade obviously requires healing that Danhung cannot provide. So in a sense, you could say the choice between Danhung and Huohuo is intrinsically tied to the Sparkle and Blade slot respectively, and your pairings in the third and fourth slot of the team will almost always go hand in hand. Yes, you can absolutely use other characters in this final slot if you require Sparkle and Blade on other teams, which is understandable given how many characters want these two nowadays, or if you don't have either of them, but just know that other variations will be generally worse at equal investment. Danhung PT and Huohuo are also a lot more interchangeable in teams without Sparkle or Mortonak's Blade. So let's go over the synergy between the different Astral Express members and their non-Express pairings. First up is the obvious Welt and Blade duo. This team plays as solo Decimation, since you're forced to bring Huopo with Mortonak's Blade, and thus, you have no way of triggering Verdict. But that's okay. The powerful buffs between Welt and Mortonak's Blade are enough to make up for the loss of Verdict. The defense thread stacking between these two is really strong, and you actually reach 100% defense thread if you add on Himeko Nova's Light Cone. On top of this, Welt activates the additional ultimate damage buff from Mortonak's Blade's double Nihility Trace, furthering his buffing potential and really rounding out the synergy between these two for Himeko Nova. Now, it should be noted that Welt does have a pretty hefty power spike when he's E4, and without his E4, he is going to fall behind a lot of these other teams. Welt's debuffs are strong prior to E4 still, but he's just not bringing enough to really make him worth it compared to Sunday and RMC having action advances. Not to mention, if your Welt doesn't have E2, his energy can also be a bit rough. Welt's main extra utility outside of his buffing comes from his ability to enable sustainless runs to be a lot safer due to action delaying enemies. But if you're always going to be running a sustain anyway, that extra utility from Welt isn't really being used and can oftentimes even be a detriment due to no longer allowing the team to get hit for energy, or for Mortonak's Blade to get hit for charge, or stalling on enemy mechanics for too long, or etc. You can see why Welt's action delay can be problematic if not being used for sustainless clears. Again, Welt is still good, especially at E4, but there has been this narrative that Himeko heavily relies on an E4 Welt in order to perform well, and that just isn't true at all. Even when Welt is E4, there are still other characters that are capable of replacing him. Now, in this team specifically, when pairing up with Mortonak's Blade, Welt and Blade synergy with each other is part of what makes it really shine. So it's not going to perform as well if you replace Welt with RMC or Sunday here, unless you also replace Mortonak's Blade. In that sense, I would say Mortonak's Blade is mainly tied to Welt, aka Blade is mainly just a Decimation teammate for Himeko. You can play Welt with Sparkle as another Decimation team, and this team also allows you to use Dan Heng to enable Verdict as well, but there just isn't as much natural synergy between Sparkle and Welt. The team will still perform fine, of course. Naturally, if you replace Welt with RMC or Sunday, then the team is going to end up being a solo Verdict team, since Welt is the literal only worthwhile teammate for triggering the Decimation state for Himeko. Like I said earlier, if you're going to play RMC or Sunday, then you'll generally replace Mortonak's Blade with Sparkle in the last team slot instead. Just like with solo Decimation, running a solo Verdict team is still worth the loss of the Decimation state, just because the character synergies are strong enough. The constant and consistent action advances between Sparkle and Sunday or RMC gives the team a lot of constant turns and constant assist skills, so long as you have Dan Heng PT on the team to help consume the assist skills, given how many turns Himeko is going to be taking. The Sparkle and Sunday pairing really doesn't need any introduction for being a standard hypercarry setup, and they especially felt like the best go-to baseline team for Himeko Nova, unless you're in a matchup that specifically favors the Welt and Mortonak's Blade Decimation team instead. For most people, especially at lower investment, I would expect this team to be their best performing team based on my own testing. So, in general, we have the Decimation team and the Verdict teams separated depending on enemy matchup. Again, technically you can mix and match the Astral Express teammates instead in order to activate both Decimation and Verdict, but the synergies between these characters is just a little too underwhelming, despite the fact that you would think that having the ability to switch between Decimation and Verdict states would be her best playstyle. It really does feel like it should be, but as of right now, that just isn't the case outside of sustainless setups. I will give an honorable mention to March 7th The Hunt for being capable of enabling some funny stuff with Himeko in certain matchups and in sustainless teams, especially when Himeko is E2, but realistically nobody is playing this, so I don't want to muddy up the waters of this video by going into it too much. The generalist support slot of Blade and Sparkle can also be taken up by other generalist supports, like Tribi or even Saridra, who especially gets better with Himeko when Himeko is E2, since Saridra can duplicate an assist skill, but they're just generally not better than other options when Himeko is E0. So, in essence, Himeko's teams will look something like this, with the ability to mix and match supports depending on who you have available and what the matchup is going to be. In terms of performance, she's generally going to do best with solo Decimation, so Welt with Blade against AoE matchups, or you'll run Sparkle Sunday for solo Verdict. Again, mix and match supports as required, depending on what you have available. Himeko is generally a pretty flexible character. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Himeko's best teammate is actually herself. She is very similar to Finon in that if you want to maximize your Himeko team, the most important thing is to vertically invest into Himeko herself rather than focusing on getting any specific teammates for her, partially due to her ability to already utilize free or accessible supports. Himeko's E1 increases the maximum amount of assist skills she can trigger, as well as reducing the requirement to trigger said assist skills. And her E2 allows teammates aside from Astral Express teammates to also get extra turns when triggering her assist skills, while also just massively buffing her damage and giving her teammates an extra use of her assist skill. The way these these early Eidolons completely warp the way Himeko feels to play, smoothing out her assist skill rotations and buffing her damage makes them incredibly powerful for her. On top of this, Himeko's signature light cone is also one of the largest stat sticks we've ever had in the game for any single character, giving a total of 32% defense spread, 60% damage bonus for her entire kit, high base attack, and as if that wasn't enough, it also provides more energy on her assist skills to smoothen out her rotation. Himeko's vertical investments are so powerful. This, of course, has gotten her many comparisons to Finon, who is notorious for being reliant on his E2 and to a lesser degree, his S1. So, is Himeko an E2 merchant like Finon? Well, don't think of Himeko as being the same as current Finon in terms of her reliance on her E2 in order to perform. Himeko does not need her E2 in order to perform well, on release at least. Himeko's base kit is strong enough that you don't have to feel pressured to vertically invest into her if you aren't able to. But her E2 and S1 are massive power spikes, and if she does eventually end up falling off, I can definitely see a world where she becomes similar to Finon due to how much of a high priority her E2 and S1 are for her compared to any of her teammates. This is also due to Himeko likely not getting many other teammates in the near future. There is a chance some future characters can buff Himeko, such as the upcoming Robin, or potentially even a Sunday Nova Flare, but none of these things are guaranteed, and thus, Himeko ends up in a similar situation as Finon, where the best way to build a Himeko team is to rely on Himeko herself and her own vertical investments. So, how do you vertically invest into Himeko? She is, once again, very similar to Finon. If you can reach Himeko's E2, then you rush straight there. However, if you can only get one extra cost for Himeko between her E1 or her S1, and you won't be able to make it all the way to her E2, then just go for her S1 instead. Himeko's E1 is not bad by any means. In fact, it's a lot better than most other DPS E1s. It's just that her S1 is very strong and doesn't have very many alternatives. The one exception to this would be if you have the Herta's light cone, which isn't necessarily all that close to Himeko's S1, but Herta's signature light cone is good enough to where you can go for Himeko's E1 instead of Himeko's S1 if you have Herta's light cone, especially since you are then one step closer towards Himeko's E2. So, in terms of Himeko's team building, you can refer to the guide from earlier, but in terms of Himeko investment, the best way to build a Himeko team is to always bet on Himeko herself. Again, if you can't invest further into Himeko beyond E0, don't worry, she will perform perfectly fine on release. And then you can always worry about getting her vertical investment breakpoints on her rerun if she does start to struggle, similarly to how Finon did. So don't feel the need to rush to vertically invest in her right away on her first banner if you want to save pulls. Now, how does Himeko Nova compare to other current DPSs? She is arguably going to be the best DPS in the game on her release, definitively in the top 3. So I don't think you need to worry about her power level when she releases. My main concern with Himeko is the potential lack of supports. This wouldn't be an issue if we didn't know about future upcoming characters, but we do know that Robin is coming out as a buff for Remembrance teams, Aventurine is coming out as a buff for either Elation teams or Follow-Up Attack teams, which are already competing with Himeko with just Ashvale and Blade, and then Pearl and Nihilux will also be coming out eventually, presumably for Elation teams. So we know all the other main relevant team archetypes competing with Himeko are for sure going to get upgrades, whereas Himeko doesn't seem to have any new character releases on the horizon. This doesn't mean Himeko is going to start falling behind the other teams necessarily. This just means she might become more reliant on her own vertical investments, just like Finon did, if she gets no new teammates, while all the other teams do get new teammates, which we already discussed before, so just be mindful of that in the future. Besides, it isn't necessarily bad for Himeko to have very powerful vertical investments in place of having new teammates released for her, especially for people who are just really big fans of Himeko and would prefer to just invest into her own Eidolons over anything else. All in all, my final verdict on Himeko Nova is that, on release, she's going to be a very strong character, and if you are pulling for her, you'll be pretty happy with her performance. She has a variety of different teammates that she can mix and match between for similar results, and a lot of these teammates are either very accessible or very generalist supports that a lot of accounts have anyway, meaning the chances of your account having a team for Himeko is pretty likely, leaving ample room for you to focus on her own vertical investments, which is the main way to invest into Himeko teams to begin with. I think Himeko fans will be pretty happy with the treatment Himeko has gotten, both in terms of gameplay and story presence. She absolutely feels like the Finon of Plan Arcadia in every sense, which is a comparison you absolutely want, and it's very fitting that this treatment would go to none other than our mother of the Astral Express, who has been by our side since day one. But what are your opinions on Himeko Nova and how she turned out? Do you have any strong opinions on her comparisons to Finon, especially with her Eidolons being the best and potentially the only real way to invest further into her teams? Which teammates are you planning on using with her if you're pulling for her? Let me know in the comments below. And if you need any further advice on her team building or investment path, ask away, and I'll do my best to answer. While you're at it, like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. There will definitely be more HSR content coming, especially for the upcoming characters of Robin and Aventurine. I plan to do a lot of content covering Aventurine especially. So be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!